Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. For those who don't know me, I'm Louis Woodall, founder and editor of Climate Proof, where we cover adaptation, finance, tech, and policy. Today's session is Driving Competitive Advantage through Spatial Finance, and it's brought to you in partnership with Earth Finance, a global advisory firm and technology platform that help organizations design pragmatic and sustainable growth strategies. And in partnership with Climate Proof, Earth Finance recently authored a white paper on the topic of spatial finance, and I encourage all of you online to grab a copy. I'm going to put a link in the group chat now. Yeah, so you should see it there. This is the fruit of many hours of labor by myself and the Earth Finance team, so really appreciate you taking a look at it, sharing it around, and letting us know your thoughts. So what exactly is spatial finance and how can it drive a greater understanding of physical and transition risks and opportunities? That's what we're here to find out. And to help me unpack the topic, I'm joined by three people who live this work every day. Caleb White, head of global GTM at Earth Finance, who help us define spatial finance and why it matters now. Alma Cortez-Selva, senior advisor, climate modeling at BMO, who will bring a financial institutions perspective. And Kevin Eckel, head of environmental affairs at Bayer Consumer Health, who'll share how this plays out for corporate decision makers on the ground. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we dive in. Please stay muted throughout the session to keep the audio clean, and feel free to drop any questions into the chat as they come to you. I'll be pulling from them during our closing round, and I'll put information in there as well as our participants speak. This section is also being recorded for future publications, so keep a weather eye on your inboxes after the event for your copy. With that, I will like to start by turning to Caleb and asking, how do you define spatial finance and why does it matter now for companies and investors?
Thanks, Louis. And Alma, Kevin, great to see you. Thanks for having us today. And hopefully it's informative for all the folks on the call today. Well, the roots of spatial finance go back to 2019, and it was coined, I believe, first by the Spatial Finance Initiative, which was launched out of the University of Oxford with a number of academic and financial partners. And in essence, spatial finance, the definition is the integration of geospatial data and analysis with financial modeling and theory. It's a very eloquent way to define it. When it boils down to it, we're talking about marrying the physical things that we know on planet Earth, like roads, buildings, assets, manufacturing facilities, agriculture, with the financial modeling and the value of said things, whether that value is direct or indirect. And so in essence, we're looking at what is changing and what are the impacts and dependencies on those physical things. And how does that affect the financials of an organization or a region or a country? Because we have different perspectives and different stakeholders, of course, when we look at location intelligence. And ultimately, it's trying to find where do we need to allocate capital? Where are things material enough that we should make changes to help inform, our financial decision making? And for most organizations and for most, regions or entities that we work with, it's really about ensuring resilience in the future and ensuring that they can grow in a resilient way. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Any questions on that? And I can go into sort of why does it matter? Why is it, important to organizations that we work with?
Yes, I call it like this alchemy between location-specific data, geographic data, and financial variables, right? And I've always been interested in how you can actually kind of bridge that gap, right? Because you can see where an asset is, facility is, a piece of infrastructure, but how do you then translate that into financial metrics for a corporate or for a public balance sheet? And that's the part I think is interesting. And that's the kind of capability gap that's been bridged in recent years. So Caleb, happy for you to kind of expand on how it's being used and how it's useful to your clients.
What we were talking about at the top of the call in terms of the smoke, extreme heat across Europe. And I think historically, the whole sustainability ESG movement has largely focused around, ESG, environment, social, and governance. But what we're seeing is that there's both physical and transition, items on the list that are changing rapidly and they're changing dynamically. So it's not just the planetary boundaries of extreme weather, water, nature, and our future climatic conditions, but it's also aging infrastructure. It's AI and data center growth. It's an energy story. It's geopolitics, and it's policy. And when we look at spatial finance, what I like about the generic term of spatial and finance is that it's able to ladder all of those up at a specific location. And to your point, look at these interdependencies of how they're affecting, because they are also, extremely tightly coupled. And so I think previously, perhaps there's been a fairly narrow lens when we say, okay, if there's tariffs happening or a new policy instrument starts to change shape on the energy side, how does that affect the financial wherewithal of organizations and regions? And ultimately, from a corporate perspective, I think it's a very detailed analysis of their entire value chain. So it's not just about the physical assets that they own or operate in. It's also about where are they producing, where are they sourcing from. The value chain includes the supply chain. And so we're looking at that holistically and then starting to understand from a financial analysis perspective, what is changing, where is it changing, what's it affecting, and how do we ultimately allocate capital to build resilience and future growth?
Yes, I want to double click on that, how we allocate capital point. But first, I want to turn to Alma and ask, from a financial institution's perspective, how are spatial finance insights being used and how they're useful to your role and to that of the bank as a whole?
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Caleb. Building on what Caleb was saying, like you said, it's like location based. Whether we're talking about drought, flooding, wildfire, or water stress, what spatial finance is doing is translated into financial implications so that decision makers in our bank can act on. So from banking perspective, it's incredibly valuable because, for example, which is my domain, climate risk, is rarely evenly distributed. What we're seeing, especially in bank terms, is to borrowers in the same industry, they can have very different risks depending on where their assets, operations, or suppliers are located. Like Caleb was saying, like looking holistically at the supply chain. So spatial finance is providing another layer of insight. So it's helping identify the concentrations of risk, opportunities as well, and then across regions, sectors, borrowers, and then assessing physical, especially physical climate risk, and then how it's evolving over time. And that's why it's so important, and have more informed conversations with our clients about resilience, adaptation, and even ask better questions. Like we're now asking, hey, what's the future viability of a particular operation, especially on ag? Where might adaptation create better value? Which assets are more likely to be resilient? So that just having spatial finance move those conversations from like very broad climate considerations to actionable business decisions.
Yes, climate physical risk, but also energy and water risk are so context specific, right? Location specific. And you need to have analytics that don't generalize and abstract, but actually are rooted in the location you're based. And Kevin, I want to turn to you now and ask for the view from a corporate. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about your role, first of all, so understand, and how spatial finance integrates with your day-to-day.
Sure thing. So I'm as the head of environmental affairs for the consumer health division. Anything that goes on, takes place in our business that leaves an environmental impact or could leave an environmental impact falls to me in some way, shape, or form. I'm not necessarily the person responsible for hitting targets, but I help guide the strategy and implementation and execution of all these things. And so the way I think about it is we use it, I guess, in the short term on a day-to-day basis. I think we are using it in one way, which is kind of across the supply chain. Where are the immediate short-term risks to their facilities? And we do this for our own real estate as well. Whether it's typhoons, severe rainfall, drought, flooding, whatever the case may be, wildfires, whatever the case may be, where are our suppliers and our physical footprint? Where might the risks be presented today so that we have a chance to manage them? And then you can kind of sort of span that out as with, looking at weather forecasts over the next week. Where is there likely to be a severe heat that impacts our operations and potentially could impact our on-site workers? But likewise, for us, where might that impact the consumer? And so those are the ways we tend to look at it in the short term, more risk management than opportunity, but the opportunity comes into it. But more on the long term is really where we start to focus on the opportunity, because then we can look at things like maps of the future, forecasts of the future, whether it be climate on temperature, air pollution, rainfall. You can overlay those different maps and say, for instance, as a consumer healthcare business who has an interest in whether in the intensity, length, and allergens that kick off allergic responses, it might be something for us where, what might the allergens in Southeast Asia be? Not just concentrations, but what specific allergens might there be? Do our products currently help manage that sort of allergic response? Or, and if so, great. If not, is there, given the trends, do we need something stronger? May we need something stronger than just our base medicine? But also it's with the, I must say, while I have a biology background, I don't remember all of the physiological and immunological implications. So admittedly, this is just hypothetical example, but if there is sort of a spreading of the allergens geospatially, such that oak trees no longer being an allergen in Northeast US, that's not necessarily the case, but just hypothetically so. Or you start to see convergence in an individual area of a couple key allergens that seem to be especially problematic. Can you design an allergy medication that is more specific to those allergens, so that you go from what is currently a more general response to almost anything, but the success of which is really dependent upon the individual, to something where this allergy medication manages the response to these allergens, and those allergens happen to be hyper localized here, type of thing. So that's the way, from a risk and opportunity point of view that we look at it.
And presumably before spatial finance capabilities became mainstream, became available, this sort of analysis would be much more cost intensive. Would you have to be having people walking around on the ground with allergen sensors? Like, I'm imagining that was how it used to be done.
Well, thankfully, there's a lot of people interested in allergies, so it's an allergen. So there's the sensors have been in place for a while, but it's more of the integration of what the geospatial outlook is, and then tying it to finance that is really the innovation. And it's sort of because what that allows us to do is say, hey, this is where it's going to occur. This is the population size that it could impact. And from our perspective, this is what we would expect for demand, a change in demand, which is, here's the revenue opportunity. That provides us a very concrete variable where we can say, is this pot of opportunity large enough for us to make an investment? And if so, just how big of an investment do we want to make? So it's really the enabling quantitatively the combination of the geospatial map and the geospatial information with our own internal financial measures that really sort of starts to unlock things.
Thanks for elaborating on that. It sounds like spatial finance capabilities enable even large companies to be a bit more nimble, as you said, like be able to decide when an investment can be made profitably to address a new risk or a geospatially distributed risk that you hadn't thought about before. So that's very interesting. But you kind of touched on this, the topic about outputs, like what actually comes out of spatial finance. And I want to go back to Caleb and ask about inputs and outputs, right? Because when we talk about spatial finance, I think a lot of people think first of like satellite imagery, LiDAR data, and they can picture those large image files and how they can look on a dashboard or how they can look on a map. But how do you translate that data into this dollars and cents that companies want, right? And what data do you need from companies themselves or from other sources to really make that magic happen with spatial finance?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that the use cases are far and wide, and there's thousands of them. And I think that, there's no silver bullet for all use cases out there, in my opinion, but I think there's the same construct that has to happen. And if we work backwards from the use case, Kevin gave a really good example about allergens, and we've seen a number of use cases within that, health field. And one thing that comes to mind from a corporate perspective, and I'll kind of double click on what Kevin said, was the internal financial information of the corporate itself, or of the region, or said, entity that we're evaluating. A lot of that is internal knowledge, and it's sort of trade secrets and is protected. We can get some of it through, financial statements, not always public, but definitely P&L, definitely balance sheet, cash flow statements. We're speaking the language of finance here as an output for capital decisions or financial decision making. And so we drill down into that. We start to look at, yes, asset locations, asset valuations. We look at inventories. We look at revenue. We look at suppliers, trade routes. What about downtime, uptime in certain factories or certain locations? All of that is sort of internal proprietary information that is largely not sourced from just open data. We need to start to get into the weeds and understand the complexities and the intricacies of the internal environment. And then once we have that, then we can marry what you said at the first side, the spatial side. So do we need, nature data? Do we need water stress data? Do we need energy data? Do we need data about supply chains or trade routes? Do we need policy information about different policy instruments and when they're going to be coming into effect? When you start to marry those two together, then we start to answer the question of what is happening from a financial perspective, and is there materiality that is exposed in a good way or a positive, or in a negative or a positive way, by the way. And we did this for a corporate on the energy side, where we evaluated hundreds of their locations across the US and the world, and looked at it from an energy risk perspective, a supply risk, a price risk perspective, and then understood, which locations are the most optimal for interventions to, install solar, battery backup, whatever it might be. And what's the ROI on that? Not only from a financial perspective, but also from a carbon perspective. And then once we get to that, then we can start to embed that into a business case, and we can actually get capital deployed. And so we always start with the use case in mind, and then we work backwards into, okay, what geospatial data do we need? And there are thousands and thousands of data sets. There's been never a better time in history to use geospatial, but once you get into it, you realize it is unequivocally big data. It's really hard to understand, and there's thousands of them. So somebody needs to piece through what we need to use, and it can get really, really down the rabbit hole quickly. And so part of what our role is to kind of identify what is useful, what's material, to merge those two worlds together.
Kevin, you seem to be giggling there. Is that because you understand when you said it can get very complex very quickly, that resonates with you?
Well, it can. But I guess that another message that I would say is that, and this is where thinking about later on in the discussion, but something you might consider as you're setting up this is like, exactly what are the questions that you want to answer, and not just saying, okay, jumping into some big data analytic program and starting to ask queries and things like that. But what are the questions that you really need an answer to that bring together spatial and finance? But I would also say, in response to Caleb, yes, it can get complicated, but part of the, I guess I would say, art of using this is how can you make it really, really simple? Because if I've done it in a way that is simple. I'm just not intelligent enough to use fine-grained spatial information. So I'm looking at it at a more macro scale. And so, categorizing different risk variables as like, how serious is it? What's the likelihood that it will actually strike a physical site? Combine that with, if a production site may go offline for whatever reason, what is the cost that we will incur on a day-to-day basis in lost sales? And so it can get incredibly complex really, really quickly. And it will present all sorts of rabbit holes that you can pursue and go down. But I think you don't necessarily have to get too complex. There are ways that you can simplify it. And if I've been able to present financial models to teams internally using spatial information, trust me, it is not complicated math.
Yes, it sounds like there's like a cascade approach you could take from very, very simple, getting more and more complex, right? And you can get useful answers from spatial finance, but you need to craft the questions well to get these useful answers. Okay, we'll go more into operationalizing spatial finance in a minute, but I want to turn to Alma again and ask a little bit about, again, the financial institution context. My understanding is that historically banks have used good-looking assumptions, historical data to kind of model out risks to assets and clients. And we know because of climate change, which is changing kind of distribution of future risks, that we can't rely on backward data. So can I ask how you're using spatial finance insights to kind of soup up your modeling, your scenario analysis of how climate change will affect your clients and your business?
Thank you. It's just funny the last comment from Kevin and how well it ties to the question, because we did an exercise, like Kelly would call it, with their team. And then, like Kevin was saying, we first needed to define that question to be able to find the right variables. So the example that we came up was on agriculture, and it was water stress and drought risk across regions in California, Arizona, and Colorado, because they were the most affected. That's why I was really laughing when you were talking, Kevin, because it was like, you had that exercise. That's how the exercise went. We're like, okay, let's define the question so that Caleb can provide like the right set of variables on the spatial side. So if we were relying just on the historical data, many of the regions, especially in the California, Arizona, and Colorado area, are incredibly productive, and they would look economically resilient. But because they're some of the most important areas of agricultural areas in North America. But when we brought in that spatial finance variables, looking at the water stress projections, looking at water stress, drought risk, looking at groundwater depletion, irrigation constraints, we discovered that risk varied dramatically across counties, even counties that were neighboring counties. So some counties with very large agricultural output were exposed. Other counties that you didn't expect that were smaller, with smaller production bases, faced even greater risk because of local water conditions. And that's like bringing in that present and then forward-looking variables really help. So for example, something that was really striking, we did a hypothetical exercise of reduction in 5% of irrigation water. And then we found that even for some of the smaller counties, the projected losses could reach like hundreds of millions of dollars, which we didn't expect. So that changed the conversation from just talking about agricultural in general terms. And then we could identify, hey, where are the most significant risk, like Caleb was saying, materiality, and then which commodities, which locations, adaptation measures, like Kevin said, like opportunities that could come from this. So that's the essence for me of spatial finance, that climate change doesn't affect every location the same, and it's not equally distributed. And that's why we need those special tools, like because we need to look at everything geographically and bring it all together.
So Alma, you can get this sort of granularity of insight about different counties like water risk, for example, and that's very useful from a kind of research data perspective. But I'm wondering, actually, has the kind of front office caught up with that? Can you actually operationalize these decisions? Can you do, is this leading to more selective, like lending opportunities, different products being launched? I'm just kind of wondering if you've got all this data, can actually be operationalized yet at the front line, because it's much more granular, much more specific than might have been used before.
The short answer to that would be, yeah, it's leading to new products and to new opportunities. So we're not trying to change the models, because some of them have to be backward looking and then they have to look at the historical data, but then we can look at the opportunities and then complement it. And that's where the opportunity really lies, because you are like complementing the data. You're not trying to replace, you're trying to complement and then, hey, get new insights from the data that you're provided. And that's the beauty of it, because you're looking not just at past looking data, because you have that, but you're also looking at forward looking projections. That's where I see that good combination, because you need to have both to have good decision making.
I want to stay with some case studies. So I think that's what personally I'm very interested in learning about how spatial finance is being used, and I'm sure the participants are too. And actually, I'll encourage participants in the chat, if you have specific use cases that you've yourself deployed for spatial finance, or use cases you're wondering whether spatial finance could be useful in, please do drop them in the chat. But Caleb, I was wondering, maybe you had an additional case study to share about the use of spatial finance with client.
Yeah, we were talking in the prep calls, Louis, like the one about the beauty company that we worked with.
Yeah,
and they were sourcing some commodities within their supply chain, in terms of vanilla, and a number of different micro ingredients that I'd never heard of before, but they come from certain regions in the world and are highly sensitive to certain growing conditions. And so, to Kevin's point about extrapolating the future, the allergens and how the dynamic nature changes, depending on a number of different variables, whether it be weather, temperature, humidity, in growing conditions, we looked at the underlying growing conditions of those said micro ingredients and said, okay, where are they being grown today? What does that look like in 2030, 2040, 2050? How does that affect yield? And then how do we convert that to a price metric? And then we get to the financial output of, okay, there's a, stochastic modeling that happens that says, depending on the different, future climatic scenario, we have this sort of now measure or bar of what could the financial implications look like, which provides the ability to, look at our margins, or in this case, the company's margins. Okay, can our margins support a 2%, a 4%, a 6%, whatever it might be, increase in costs? And when we did that, the exercise revealed that it was like there are, you've heard the term millions of dollars around the table here a few times, and it's at that level in terms of the bands into which it could result. And obviously, these are projections; they're not predictions. But to Kevin's point about the future planning area of this, in terms of strategic planning and where things may go in 10, 20, 30 years, we also have to have the other side of the coin, which is what's happening today, what's happening in the next 2 weeks, what's happening this growing cycle. And we've seen that across cocoa, we've seen that across coffee, in terms of price increases and, articles about Easter chocolate being more expensive because of growing conditions, in Madagascar or other places. And so we're seeing the impacts of that in the day to day. And so I think what organizations are trying to understand is, how do we accommodate that in our value chain today? What are the financial implications, and how do we make potentially interventions on that? And then what does this look like in 10 years? Do we need to reroute our supply chain? Can we even grow that commodity, in the future in that region? And should we be looking at our supply chain in more granularity? And I was just doing some read a couple of weeks ago, actually, on the wine industry and how it's shifting regions. I also have a friend that's on the east coast of Canada. I'm based in Ottawa, Canada myself.
Very important industry.
Yeah, exactly. And I also have a friend that grew up in the east coast of Canada, his family owned a lobster fishery, and the lobster are moving, right, because of the warming temperature. So they're going from the eastern seaboard of the US, and they're migrating depending on the temperature that's required for the specific species of lobster. So to our point about risks and opportunities, the fact of the matter is that it's changing, and organizations are trying to understand both the short-term dynamic perspective as well as that long-term capital allocation. And then the last cherry on top is that a lot of the lobster that are harvested in the US on the East Coast, there's production facilities in Canada. And so now we get into trade policy. So you can see that this spatial exercise is, yes, it's climatic, yes, it's extreme events, yes, it's water, it's also energy, and it's absolutely policy. And so we start to ladder these up and be like, okay, we could grow it here, we could move our supply chain here, but the policy's changing, and that actually is not economically viable anymore. And so being able to ladder those up and look at it in a multifaceted way is, in my opinion, that's kind of the essence of spatial finance. We see it borne out in a lot of these examples with customers that we work with, but unequivocally in the news that most of us follow.
I feel maybe it should be called spatial temporal finance, though, because you're making this point about there's short-term risks, long-term risks. Large corporates, they need to think about how their supply chains may be affected in the next few months, next year, to make hedging decisions or to switch suppliers, but also long-term when it comes to capital allocation. And again, I want to come to you, Alma, on this. You have to think business cycle terms, 5-10 year horizons, right? And naturally, because of the speed in which our climate is changing, and because also the specificity with which climate change affects different regions, you need to have credible long-term views to make decisions. So Alma, I wanted to ask you for another example of spatial finance in action. You gave an agriculture one. Commercial real estate. Real estate is one that comes up a lot in my conversations when talking about physical risk analytics. I was wondering if that was something close to your heart, or any other example you have which you could share.
I think commercial real estate is an excellent one. It's so easy to picture. So we did a study that we published last December, and it was all about the climate risk, and then assessing for commercial real estate across North America, where the hazards were, and then going very granular, then looking within even the same cities at different locations within the cities and different buildings. So we started with a spatial assessment of physical climate hazards and then translated those into financial impacts. Like Caleb was mentioning, you need to go from, hey, you are looking at the hazard and then translate it into financial impact. And then when you do that, we got something that we call the climate value at risk, or CVAR. What was interesting from that study is, even though we looked at 20 or more locations, there was one that stood out. Out of all of them were exposed with different levels, and then all of them had at least one extreme hazard. But one of the properties in Miami Beach, I'm sure you're not surprised, particular stood out. And then when we quantified the risk, we estimated that the property faced close to 5 million in climate-related financial exposure over a 10-year period. The interesting part was the opportunity, because when we were looking at adaptation measures, we were like, okay, it's that property is really affected by flood. And then one of the things that we could do to make it more resilient and then prevent some of the losses was create a engineered flood protection barrier. That cost around $250,000, but it could reduce the probability of losses or the climate-related risk from 5 to 1.4 million. So you never completely, you're never gonna have losses, but you could decrease it significantly. And then when we're looking at the barrier's life, it cost 250,000, but then when we look at it through the expected life, it generated a benefit cost benefit ratio of 1 to 43. So that means that for every dollar that you invested, you get $43 in return from prevention from future losses. So that's a great example for me of why spatial finance is so valuable, because if we have the flood map alone, it tells you that there's a problem, which is important. Don't get me wrong. But translating that problem into a financial decision and then allowing investors, lenders, and owners to identify where capital can be better deployed, I think that's what's really powerful. That's, I think, what Kevin and then Caleb have been mentioning. And then on the examples, it's like that translation and then better looking not only at the risk, but looking at the opportunity. That's what's so important.
Yes, what you're referencing there is sometimes called like adaptation ROI, right? What is the return on investment of investing in a measure that helps you become more resilient to fiscal risk, but also, I suppose, as Caleb was intimating earlier, like making more resilient to energy transitions, to policy shifts, etc. And there's been a lot of effort to try like generalize the quantification of adaptation ROI. And you may have seen studies by various think tanks and consultancies saying $1 invested in adaptation equals $10 in economic gains or $10 in financial reward. But really, I think what you touched on there, Alma, is that it is so specific again. Like what measure works for one context for one building may not make any sense for a building, even if it's like very near to that other building. You could generalize, but actually you won't get the sort of fine-grained analysis you need to make a good decision. And on that, Kevin, I want to turn to you again and ask a little bit about how spatial finance insights may have helped you with an internal discussion or with your colleagues about deciding to take one investment over another, because we know corporations are entities where arguments and debates are often fought and often won with data. So I'd be interested in an example to share with our audience.
Yeah, I think it's more, I'd say probably a mixed result outcome, but it is something where, I go back to, it kind of goes back to the part of the allergen story that I shared before. It was, we were debating with our category team, to what degree should climate change be included in longer term forecasts? And they had an initial variable, projection that we thought was relatively small and not exactly correct. And so, I looked at and was not sort of reflecting how allergens and the risk of allergies would be different. Some places, as the future unfolds, it's going to be safer. Some places it's going to be much more risky. So yeah, we sort of developed a model using IPCC models to look at just what we described earlier: temperature expectations, out to 2040, rainfall expectations, and we sort of looked at one of the benefits of having one of the world's largest agricultural firms next door. So we looked at what are the typical growing seasons for some of your key crops. We have solutions for any number of different crops, and we have a role in growing all of them. And so it's just like, as you go around the world, what is the peak sort of growing season? And to what degree, might that correlate with allergy season? Likewise, we went to our allergen category team. It's like, how are you seeing allergy seasons play out? Is it getting concentrated, but more concentrated at any one given time, but the peaks are getting higher? Or is it something that is much more of the risks start earlier and they're plateauing earlier and they're staying more constant? They're staying constant for a longer period of time. So that was one of the questions that we were answering. But it was also a case of, based on the data that we were able to pull from ICC maps and the model that we were able to create, I think we demonstrated fairly, what I think was fairly convincingly of look, while you may be incorporating climate change to a degree in your future forecasts, the degree to which it's more likely to happen is at a much faster rate. And here are the places where it's going to be especially
Don't change
extreme.
the assumptions.
Correct. And so it became a different conversation, and it was pretty cool.
Excellent. Yes, the idea of data helping to reframe a conversation, or make trade-offs a little bit clearer is one of the real values of spatial finance. We can keep going. I can keep going at least for 15 minutes or so. I think the audience members, I think if you have to drop, that's fine. But the rest of the panel, we can stay here until top of the hour. And I want to get into this topic now of operationalizing spatial finance, because again, talking about complexity, asking the questions, and Caleb, you went into all the different ways that energy, food, water risk will intersect. And I want to talk then about, so what does a company need if they, coming off the back of this webinar, thinking spatial finance sounds cool, I want to use that in my company. What are the actual steps to doing that? Who do you need? What data do you need? And what sort of institutional setup is valuable?
Well, I think Kevin touched on a lot of it. It's very similar to what we see in terms of, this being a horizontal thing across the company, number one. Number two, we need to frame the right questions. To Kevin's point, is this a short-term, more dynamic now type conversation? Or is this a strategic capital allocation, conversation for, an asset that might be in place, or a decision that might be in place for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And so, finding those champions that are able to add context, internal context to that question. That could be somebody from sustainable sourcing. It could be somebody from construction or real estate. It could be somebody from, operations or facilities. And I think ultimately the business case has to be boiled up. I heard a leader in a major bank globally at Trellis, and she was remarking that their CEO was saying we need to speak the language of climate, speak the language of finance. And I think that's one of the things within the organizations we work with is it does need to ladder up to a business case and some sort of financial decision making, because oftentimes this does land on the CFO's desk. And the CFO is trying to figure out, do I allocate capital here for this use case? Do I allocate capital here and here? And it could be the case that we, through spatial finance, identify a number of different ways that it could be, important to build resilience to ensure future growth. We could say, okay, do we want to install 70 million of solar and battery backup at these locations, or do we want to put in, leak detection or water reuse in these manufacturing facilities within the same company? And being able to allocate capital across those different decisions is what the CFO is looking to do. And so there needs to be a business case. It needs to be rooted in that. So I think the first step is looking at what questions are we trying to answer, and who would help inform those questions across the organization to start to build that business case. And obviously we can feed it with data, we can feed it with modeling, but it starts to happen at that level institutionally.
And are you seeing spatial finance and your capabilities at Finance being deployed for like one-off projects? Because you gave the example of this beauty company. And are we going to see a world where actually spatial finance is more integrated into day to day? I mean, again, I suppose it depends on cost and availability, and again, scaling up of the team. But it does sound to me like, in experience, like spatial finance companies, data is used for like specific problems, and then great, we've got the data, we'll move on. Is that going to be the sort of part of the course, or you think?
I think it's one of these yes ands. So yes, it is that. And then there's also the follow-on. So Alma was talking about the property in Florida and doing that calculation, say what are the interventions that we could to make sure that we are increasing resilience and increasing future growth potential. And so you could also envision a scenario where there's a need to monitor that on an ongoing basis. So which projects did we install flood barriers? Which projects did we install solar and battery backup, so that the organization has a risk and opportunity profile across their entire portfolio? So a lot of times we're speaking with customers to say, how do I track this project and the multifaceted projects across their enterprise, across multiple domains, to have that portfolio view of how are we tracking overall in terms of our, are we a going concern? Have we captured resilience, and are we ensuring future growth? So it is a yes, and it's a, let's do some of these, one-time exercises, but oftentimes it's a dynamic thing. Not to mention, the points that Kevin was making about the 2-week forecast, the seasonal forecast. What are we doing this year? What are we doing this quarter? What are we doing this month? So I think it's a yes and.
Excellent. And as it's the last few minutes, if folks do have questions they want to put in the chat, please do. I'll see if we can get to them. Alma, I feel like I'm asking you this question 3 different ways now, but I'm interested in this idea of, like, again, with a bank, how do you plug in spatial finance data into the bread and butter of bank risk management, like that? Credit assessments, market risk assessments, commodity pricing, because it feels like the financial industry has been building their capabilities here, and there's been some really interesting consolidation of data providers that service the financial industry. Most recently, MSCI purchased First Street, a company that does physical risk analytics, and there's a lot of excitement about what that means for the accessibility and availability of geospatial data for the financial industry. But I'm wondering, again, from your point of view, how do you internally kind of make use of the data you're finding spatial finance across banking operations?
I think, like Caleb and Kevin have mentioned, it's the translation, because climate scientists are really good at projecting hazards, be it like wildfires. And I think we're hearing that it's going to be a super El Nino for 2026, 2027. So they're really good at that. Financial institutions were really good at evaluating financial outcomes. The challenge has been in connecting the two. So I think, so for like a flood map doesn't tell much to a credit officer in our office. Neither does a projection showing like more drought. So if I go with that to them, they're going to be like, okay, thank you. How do I use it? So what's been really useful is understanding how those hazards might influence the revenue generation, the operating cost that both Kevin and Caleb have talked about, insurance availability, which is something that we haven't really touched upon, but it's something that's coming up more and more in the news, asset values, productivity, expected losses. So that's why trying to build financially relevant metrics is so important. The example of real estate, where we had like the C-bar metrics, helped us understand the value at risk. The example of agriculture helped us understand possible losses. So translating that information into financial outcomes makes it much easier to actually incorporate into decision making, especially for banks. So that's why I said I don't think we're really trying to replace models or like our modeling. It's more adding to it, like trying to make them more forward looking and trying to gain greater insights.
Yes, I have seen in the financial industry an increase in hiring physical risk professionals, catastrophe risk modelers, and trying to use that data to kind of like bolt into the front office team to actually do underwriting of loans and investment banking and so on. Kevin, yes, I'd be interested in your view on how spatial finance data could be most favorably instituted at a corporate. I'm coming to this theory, like, because of the advance of AI and the ability to kind of cook up your own user interface, your own dashboards very easily, what matters less is like how the data is presented, kind of the quality and relevance of that data. And I'd be interested in your views there.
Yes, I'd say it's just like the age-old issue of garbage in, garbage out. Like for instance, if I really want to know where if I'm extending the allergy analogy,
Genetic like that.
sorry, you like that? Huh? Extending that, if you think about using IPC maps, which are kind of broken the world up into 47 different regions and presents median expectations for temperature increase over the next 30 years or whatever else, versus a data provider that has natural physical risks mapped down to the postal code. Those two data sets answer very different questions. And if you're using the wrong one, then either you're spending more money or you're not investing enough. And so, that's sort of one implication for me. It's make sure you're using the right data set to answer the right questions. That's a critical thing. But to me, it also, it's presenting the combination of AI and these translation tools that we're talking about, really expands the aperture on what strategic questions can you really get down to and analyze granularly. There is some technical limitations. So for instance, looking across our facilities footprint and looking at the water risks, the quality of the data is directly dependent upon the source. That said, that's a technical limitation. I would, fingers crossed, and my expectation, as I think everybody else's is that as technology matures, the granularity and the precision at which we're able to map those risks and finance them really gets enhanced, really increases. And so what our current margins of error that may be this big start to get down to here. And that allows you to answer a completely different set of questions and get very specific answers. So, it's have the questions ready, know the questions you want to answer, address, evaluate the data sets that are available and how you might use them. And if they're not ready quite yet to answer your questions, it's just a matter of time. Know what those questions are and figure out how much you can do today, but keep the questions on the table internally, so that as technology matures, you can answer them with the speed of technology.
Yes, and the data and the capabilities are maturing at an ever faster clip.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of this influential paper that came out, I think about 6 years ago, about kind of climate risk translators. There was increasing use of climate risk modeling in the financial and corporate worlds, but actually the outputs were kind of oriented towards the scientific community rather than the business community. And they had this paper posited that there was a need for a layer of translators, like professional consultants, basically, who could actually translate the findings of these climate models. And I feel like there are those outfits, a finance, you're an advisory firm and you're a tech firm. That kind of combination of data and tech and with the human touch, I think, is still very important. But I do feel, because again of AI, you can start to ask an interface, a chatbot, like, I want to know risks in this area, lay them out to me in a way I understand. I think that geospatial AI layer, which I think is something I think he was still listening, T-Bar is interested in, is going to be really interesting in the next few years. Okay, we've got time for a rapid fire round. I've got one question here, which is quite interesting, from Heidi, though, which is, to what extent is social science modeling of human behavior like migration being incorporated into spatial finance? That's a really good question, Heidi. Wonder if Caleb's got a thought, and then Kevin.
I would throw it to our team. These are the guys that dig in to all these different data sets and start to understand. But one thing I will say is that, when you look at things like extreme heat or smoke, there's certain conditions where, just like we talked about in terms of crops and specialty crops, there's just the conditions that we can survive. And so we do have clients in the Middle East and certain regions. There's we're looking at all desalination water. We're looking at extreme heat all the time. And so there's certain environments that just you have to accommodate for that social side. You mentioned at the top of the call, Louis, whether extreme heat is, affecting outdoor worker production, agriculture workers, that sort of thing. It absolutely is. And there's, very good organizations that have specialized in that. So I think it's absolutely part of the equation. The people aspect of it is often forgotten. We've seen that with some of the videos even this week of the wildfires. So yeah, Kevin, anything to add?
Yeah, I must say, I don't have a specific answer to your question, but let me tell you a little bit about the way I'm thinking about this, because this is a question that I've been noodling on for a couple of years. In healthcare, for healthcare providers, or for companies like Bayer Consumer Health, who provides medications to people for any number of ailments, our key question is great if we, for the conundrum that we find ourselves in is, okay, if we develop these growth strategies to go into these markets where we expect allergens to increase or heart risk to increase as a result of severe heat, what's the likelihood that a population is actually going to be there in 20 years? Or is it someplace where the physical risk presented to the population is going to cause migration? And then from there, it's rather than manage the risk, to what degree can we provide opportunities to those migrating? So that looking at present, the typical model is random. Their destination, wherever it might be, is somewhat random, and it could be dictated by family connections, could be dictated just by simple ease and transportation routes. But where is someplace that would be safe? So if you look at the inverse of natural hazards, where is someplace that's safe? Because if climate migrants are going to be on the move, then we've got an idea of, hey, if you move here, or if we direct your movement in this direction, we can build the physical infrastructure to house you and to feed you and to take care of you, your health and your health care when you arrive. That's not necessarily, obviously, not a short-term answer, but it's a way that, to me, in my mind, it's a way that you can look at it, and it presents the fun sort of ethical questions for businesses in this place of, hey, should we take a more active hand in providing options and directing people in a certain direction, rather than just allowing them to disperse what seems to me to be relatively randomly?
Thank you. Excellent example there, Kevin. Alma, you have your hand up. Did you have something to add here?
It's a super interesting question, because we're actually taking that into account. And we had a survey where we asked the question whether people were taking climate considerations in deciding where to buy. And I forget, I think it was like 30 to 40% had actually decided not to go with a property because of climate considerations. So like, we forget that people are actually taking into account. And I've seen more and more surveys actually doing it for real estate and then for other contexts, where people are actually saying, I may not want to live in this region or in this specific house because it has a really high risk of flooding, especially that's one that comes up. And then then I'm not gonna be able to have insurance. So people are thinking about that, and we should, as either corporates or banking industry or whatever we are, take that into account, because people are taking into account.
Yes, changing financial behavior is a very interesting and very important variable. Okay, we're coming to the top of the hour. Sorry, can't get to all your questions, but please do read the white paper. I put it again in the chat, so you can learn more about spatial finance there. To finish, I just want to ask each panelist very quickly, what is one misconception of spatial finance you think people should drop, or what one thing can they do in the next 12 months to operationalize spatial finance in their organization? So dealer's choice there. Caleb, do you want to go first?
Well, I feel like I'll sound like a broken record, but I'd love to just propose that it's not only a 2050 and a climate thing. It is a now and today thing. And it's also energy. It's also water. It's also people. And it's also, the planetary boundaries that we're facing. So I would encourage people to kind of look at it multifaceted and start to kind of learn things through their own research.
Very good. Broaden that horizon. Alma?
I think what I hear a lot is it's all about maps. Maps are great, don't get me wrong, but it's a good starting point. So the real value, like Caleb has said, is connecting the dots, connecting location-based information from climate to financial outcomes and business decisions. So the goal is not to create better maps. I love maps. It's to make better financial decisions with it.
And Kevin, I'll give you the last word.
Great, but what question am I answering? Yeah, you sort of cut out there for a minute.
It's up to you whether what's spatial finance misconception you wish people would drop, or how would you operationalize spatial finance in the next 12 months? What's the first step you would take as a company?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think our first step is just simply, what are the different use cases that we really want to model, and an evaluation of how granular of a data set do we need to answer that question, because that allows us to allocate time and energy and finances accordingly. So I think that's the first step. What are the questions?
Okay.
Think very carefully about what questions do you have to answer. And then the one misconception might be that it's that you really have to be good at spatial modeling and data analytics in order to pull useful information out of this. That is true. You can. The more specialized you are, the better you are at using it, the more insight you can gain from it. But you can still use a lot of insights by applying logic, rational thinking, and getting a lot of smart people, even a few smart people around the table at one time to figure out exactly what you need and how you're going to build it.
Well, we've got a lot of smart people listening to this webinar, so hopefully they'll take what they've learned today and operationalize it in their own work, in their own lives. For now, thank you all for listening in. Thank you to Caleb, Alma, and Kevin for being participants. Do get in touch with me at louis@climateproof.news. You can also get in touch with Earth Finance. I'll send over a link after this with ways you can get in touch with Earth Finance. And there will be, of course, a recording of this webinar that you can refer to in the future. So look out for that too. For now, thank you all very much. Everybody, wherever you are, have a great morning, afternoon, evening, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.